Welcome to another ASTQB webinar. Today we'll be talking about how software testing is different from medical device software. Software testing is a required activity in the medical device industry. Regulatory requirements and the risk of injury to the patient, user, and environment make this a mandatory and highly scrutinized task. While the basic software testing process and techniques apply, there are definite differences. Today, you will obtain an overview of the key FDA and international regulations that make software testing in the medical device space different from other industries. I'm excited to have our speaker today. We have Niranjan Maharaj, who has 22 years of experience in the software development and testing industry. He has more than 17 years of experience in the regulated medical device space, specializing in product development and verification and validation. Over the course of his career, his roles have spanned across systems and hardware development, software quality assurance, test automation, and user experience and human factors design. In addition to these technical and management roles, Niranjan has served as design controls SME for a number of organizations, bringing expertise in medical device quality management systems, regulations, and standards. With that, I'll turn it over to our speaker, Niranjan, and we'll be holding any questions till the end is kind of our plan here. If you do need something in the meantime, feel free to submit a question to me, and I'll help address those in the meantime. And just in case anyone is wondering, we are recording this and we will post it on the ASTQB website at the end. So Niranjan, with that, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Dave, and thank you everyone for joining us. Early afternoon on the East Coast, or here still in the morning on the West Coast. So as Dave mentioned, we will cover software testing in the medical device space, and we'll treat it as an introduction to the standards that govern how we test and what we test. So a little bit more about me and my background. So today I manage a few teams at a medical device company here on the West Coast, focused on diagnostic products. So my background has been almost 20 years on not only software development, but the software testing, and also human factors and other aspects of product development in the medical device space. So we don't have the quick poll set up, but towards the end, as we mentioned, there'll be a chance to ask any questions, and on the chat window, you can send any questions you have for us. So we'll start off with why medical device software testing is different. There are a lot of similarities to testing in other fields, but every domain has something unique about it that drives some different approach that we use for software testing and drives different requirements for our software testing. So within the medical device space, there's a couple of big things that drive this difference. The first really is there is real risk to the patient, the user, and the environment from software. Software can cause real harm, and software can cause death to patients. And there's a long record of this, and it's what's driven a lot of the regulations we have today. So because software can cause harm, both to the patient, the user, and the environment, it does drive how we look at our software testing. Tied to that is, well, there are also regulations. Once you get into a realm where software can do harm, you tend to see regulations and laws enacted by governments to ensure those harms do not happen. So within not only the US, but internationally, there are laws enacted by governments and other regulatory bodies that dictate the type of testing and the amount of testing that has to be performed for software. And during the webinar, we'll cover some of these big regulations and some of these aspects that dictate some of our software testing approach. So in a non-medical device space, and we kind of abstract it up at a very high level, is when we look at our software, we're looking at the functionality of the software. We also look at frequently around the user experience and kind of the look and feel, but predominantly is the software doing what the product owner or the business think the software should be doing? So really kind of focus on that functional aspect. Once we start looking at medical device software, we still have to do all of those pieces. We still care about the software doing that functional aspect, but we now start branching off into a couple of additional areas. The big one is what we mentioned, which is the safety. Is the software safe to use? And if misused, can it cause any issues? And also, is the software effective in its intended use? So part of what a medical device is, it's being used to diagnose or treat. So it has a medical intended use, a medical purpose for that software. So part of the software testing is now looking at the effectiveness of the software to do its intended use and its intended purpose. So these additional areas start expanding what we do from a software tester perspective once we live in this medical device world. The regulations that exist covers a lot of areas. To simplify kind of how someone can look at these standards and regulations and make sense to it, frequently it's broken up into these categories that help compartmentalize what's actually required. So one of these categories we'll talk about in a few minutes is called management standards. And by management standards, what's implied is what is the quality system that has to be in place at the company? What's the quality system that has to be in place by the software development team in order to satisfy these regulations? There's a second bucket that we call these regulatory requirements. So here we have something like a common phrase you would have heard, the CFR 21 Part 11, if you're in kind of the medical device space. These are the laws enacted by Congress that give FDA the authority and give them the regulatory power to dictate certain aspects of medical device development and manufacturing. There's a third important piece that influences software testing, and that's called process standards. So the big one we'll talk about is the IEC 62304. This is the software lifecycle process that you have to comply with if you're in this medical device space. And that process covers software testing and the deliverables from the software testing area. The blue box you see on the right covers medical devices. These are typically the electromechanical medical device. If there is software within that blue box, then the gray process standards and the other standards really are recognized and they're followed. So in this webinar, we're not touching on the blue box since that's mostly the electromechanical aspects. Those are your 60601-1 standards. So let's start with one of those quality management systems, one of those regulations. So the big one that all medical device companies have to comply with and at some point get certification to is called the ISO 13485 standard. And what this standard really means, it covers the way the company does development, manufacturing. It's the overall quality standard. This is what drives all of the company's SOPs for how it does development, how it does manufacturing, how it works with vendors to purchase components, how it addresses customer complaints. So the overall quality system that the medical device supplier must meet. Within this regulation, there are certain things that are called out around testing. So within 13485, there's a section that talks about verification and validation. And while this is a standard that is more focused on the overall quality system of the company, it does call out two particular things that software testers have to be aware of. One, it's the documentation of the verification plan. So think of this as your test plans, your SQA test plans, or your verification plans. In some non-medical companies, your plans could just live in a tool, live in an ad hoc fashion, maybe just discussed in a stand-up meeting. But to be compliant with the standard, these plans have to go through a formal documentation process. And part of that documentation process includes the review and approval of the plans. So one of the first changes you start seeing is, as let's say you're a test lead on a project or someone responsible for a plan, it's not just you as the tester creating a plan and executing against that plan. There's a review of the plan that has to take place and approval of the plan that has to take place before you execute against that plan. Another interesting item called out within this standard for software testing is it's actually asking you to not only think about, but also verify, perform your testing of your medical device software as it connects to interfaces with other medical device software. And today, almost every medical device or medical software has some type of interface with the outside world, whether it's a electronic health record system, whether it's a different app that's processing the data, or a combination of devices on the same network. So almost everything today is connected to interface with other medical device software. So this standard asks that in your plans and in your activities, you are thinking about not just your software, but everything else that's connected to it, and your testing includes those scenarios as well. So let's look now at a second of those kind of quality system standards. So this one is called the ISO 4971. This is sometimes referred to as the big risk one. Almost all of the regulations that you will see in the medical device world start off focused on this topic of risk. Harm to the patient, harm to the user, harm to the environment. So this aspect of that product risk to those users is really a focus point of these standards. So this is what's called kind of that parent standard, the big one that drives the company to implement a risk management process within the company. So this is the one that dictates how you go about identifying risk, how you go about controlling risk, and how you go about monitoring the effectiveness of what's called risk control measures. So risk control measures are those things you put in your software that will prevent harm from happening to the patient, user, or the environment. So within this standard, when we look at it from the software testing perspective, there are two big areas that this standard addresses for a software tester. One is called the identification of these risk control measures. So there is a process where, and the software tester is part of that process, the team goes through the features of the software, goes through the design, and tries to identify if something goes wrong, if something does not work correctly, can, through a sequence of events, can harm occur to the user, the patient, or the environment. So if through that activity the team identifies, yes, there's something bad can happen, then what the team then does is create some software design or software constraint that says, okay, then the software shall do X, Y, Z to prevent that harm from happening. So part of the verification activity is not only confirming that risk control measure is implemented in software, but also confirming that that thing that was implemented in software actually prevents the harm from occurring and prevents those sequence of events that can lead to the harm. So we start expanding software testing, not just focused on the software requirement or the user story itself, but we now have to look at, well, what was the harm we said that could happen? What was the sequence of events that we said that if the software did not do what it should do, that harm can occur? So part of the software testing is also checking that if those sequences were to happen, the bad thing does not result, the software does the right thing, and there is no harm. So the scope of the testing, software testing, expands beyond the functional software requirement to now that it's an effective risk control measure for that harm. So if we now shift to the US regulations, the big regulations that covers software from a medical device manufacturer standpoint is called 21 CFR Section 820. So sometimes you'll see this kind of abbreviated as the QSR, the Quality System Regulation. It covers a lot of stuff. It covers everything that you do, not only from the design, but the manufacturing, how you handle customer complaints. And all of these areas may have software. So it's not just the main design aspect, but many of these areas can have software. So in all of these areas that are related to the good design, manufacturer, support, life cycle of a medical device, including medical device software, this is the regulation within the US that dictates what must be done. So the high level, that regulation has 20 big parts to it. Most of the time, if you're living in the R&D side of things, where you're working on new software features, new software application, you're living in box number 4, item number 4, what's called design controls. And we'll talk about that number 4 item in the following slide. But if you look across kind of all of these 20 items, you can have software in any of these items. For example, in number 18, if you're using some software to train your doctors, or you're using some software to train your service personnel, that software has to go through some type of software testing or qualification. If you're using software to manage customer complaints, that software also goes through some software testing. So within the medical device world, it's not just the software that's the main product, but software that's used in any of these 20 areas also falls under the regulations in terms of how that software needs to be tested. And the term you will hear frequently is it's validated for its intended use. So if I'm using software, for example, to track bugs or defects, how do I know that bug tracking system, for example, Jira, does what it's supposed to do? So that level of testing of the tools and the software you use is also something that's covered under these regulations. But let's look at number 4 in more detail, which is the software that's used in your primary product, your medical device software itself. So within that design controls bucket, there are a few things that will look familiar to anyone involved in any software development life cycle in any industry. And that goes from your basic planning, what's called design inputs. Think of these are your requirements. So these can be your user requirements, your software requirements. If companies are doing agile, these can be your user stories, your use cases. So it's the inputs into your design. Your outputs for software is typically going to be your design, your code, your executable, your application. It's the thing, software it's delivering. In addition to those basic aspects, which is your basic planning, your basic requirements, the regulations do call out reviews. And these reviews are not just reviews around requirements. These are reviews around your test cases and your test plans and all of the normal test artifacts a tester would create. Within these design controls are the big items, verification and validation. And these are not very different than the definition of verification and validation you would see in other industries or even in the ASTQB syllabus. So verification there is, do we meet our software requirements? Do we meet our user requirements from a software perspective? The validation gets to, does the software do what the user needs it to do? So when we're looking at clinical claims, medical claims for our software, can the customer use the software to achieve those goals? And that's where validation ties in. The transfer, software testers will normally not play a big role in transfer. This is typically, okay, our R&D is done, the software is done, it's verified, it's validated. I'm now doing that transfer to manufacturing or production so they can make the software or distribute it to the customer. Design history file is an important aspect. One of the big items of the regulation is the documentation of the activities performed. So think of a design history file really as a list of pointers to where things live. Where do the design reviews for that software live? Where are the verification plans, the results, the reports, the logs? So design history file is just a list of all the things you did in the project so that they're findable, they're auditable, and there's evidence that those aspects occur. And design changes is a big aspect of software life. So these are, when there's a change to the software, what's the impact assessment we're doing? What's the regression testing we're doing? What's the retesting that we're doing? So anytime there's a change, that evidence of the impact assessment and the retesting or re-verification, that kind of lives under this item of design changes. So all of those deliverables, as kind of stated in the design history file, that a software tester normally provides, from the planning, the test cases, the results, reports, the bug lists, regression testing, all of those deliverables are dictated by these processes and must be documented and saved. And all of this documentation happens throughout the life cycle. So during software development, we may be writing our test cases, we may have our test cases reviewed. So evidence of that review that happens during development is documented and stored within that design history file. So part of the deliverables for the software tester, it's confirmation that all software requirements have been correctly implemented. So I emphasize the word all because in some industries you may have your, let's say your software requirements may be a backlog of user stories, or you may have software requirements with different priorities, and you may choose to test based on the priority of those software requirements. Some of that flexibility goes away when you're in the medical device field, which is if the project is scoped to deliver X number of software requirements, there has to be complete coverage of all of those software requirements. Now, how much you test those requirements is driven by risk, and we can look at risk a little bit later on, but you have to show that all software requirements have been implemented correctly and completely. And part of that evidence that you provide to show that is not only your testing, but also traceability. The traceability between requirements and test cases. So this is the other deliverable that a software tester has to provide in the medical device world. It's not just the test cases and the test plans, but that traceability, and often this is done in a traceability matrix, that traceability to show that, yes, there is full coverage of everything. So I keep talking about this word of documentation and providing the evidence. So this is where the rules now start talking about, well, what is evidence? When I say evidence, what does evidence mean? So sometimes it's easier to say it in what evidence is not. Depending on what company you're with today or what industry you're in, you may have test cases or test plans that are run, whether they're manual or automated, that someone would execute that test case, or an automated system would execute that test case, and you just get a pass or fail. Oh, did it meet expected result? Yes or no? Those things do not meet the criteria of objective evidence. So objective evidence really is, what is that thing that you're observing? What is that thing that the automation is doing an assert on? That thing, whether it's, okay, the screen shows these values, the automation asserted on a number and the number was greater than 6, that actual thing that you're looking at is the objective evidence. And that objective evidence is what has to be recorded during execution of a test. And then, based on that objective evidence that you're recording, then you can say, yes, that thing that I'm observing, then it matches my expected result. And then you can have that conclusion that your test has passed or failed. And there's a reason the regulations ask for it this way. And part of the reason is this idea that test needs to be reproducible. So I can run the same test later, I can get the same objective evidence, and then someone in the future looking at that objective evidence can come to the same conclusion that the test passed or failed. So there's this idea of reproducible tests, auditable tests that drive the documentation of this objective evidence when a tester executes a test. So now let's start looking at the software standard itself. So within the medical device world, this is the one that drives the software development process. The specific items that cover what the developers have to do, what they have to create, and also for the testers. This standard is based on risk. It dictates certain activities that have to be performed, including software testing, based on the risk of the software system as a whole. And this standard uses 3 categorizations, 3 classes for risk, A, B, C, where A goes from this software can cause no injury or damage, all the way to the most severe, class C, where death or injury is possible due to the software. So based on these classifications A, B, and C, this standard then drives certain activities that have to be performed. So at a high level, what's the summation of all of these activities? It's very similar, if you take a look at it, to what the FDA has in its quality system regulations. There's a planning activity, there are the requirements. Think of it like our design inputs from the FDA side. But there's something very different here on that second bullet. It does not just say software requirement, it says software requirement analysis. So part of what is being asked is not only that you have software requirements, but you actually go through an analysis of the requirements. Are your requirements complete? Are they conflicting with other requirements? Are they testable? So you've heard some of these things in probably other training you've gone to or within your own company, but how you review requirements. So this standard is asking for that analysis. And if your software requirements come from some high-level requirements, let's say your system is composed of both hardware and software, well, your software may just be a component and you may have a parent requirement. So you have to review your software requirements against the parent requirement, perform that analysis. The other deliverable from this process is called a software architecture. So it is required that you create a software architecture design that talks about interfaces and other aspects of the software architecture. And depending on your safety classification, you have to verify that architecture. And there are different ways you verify it based on your safety classification. If you're in a class B, your verification could be a static review, a static test, where you have a review meeting with the team looking at the design. If you're in the more safety critical class C, these are actual test cases that you have to create that will trace to your architecture for that high risk components or the high risk areas of your software. The standard does require you to create a detailed design of the software. And similar to architecture, if you're in the high risk C category, the parts of your software that are at high risk, you have to trace to it and create tests for that design. The more traditional aspects that you're familiar with is your unit testing, integration testing, and system testing. This standard then also drives how much you have to do in terms of testing documentation for different levels. So for all of the safety levels, you have your system testing. The formality of your unit and integration testing changes based on the safety classification. And then finally, the software release. One aspect of software release that applies to software testing is what's called your anomalies list or your bug list. So if you have bugs in your software that impact your customers, you have to communicate that to your customers. And in many organizations, it will be your software tester who kind of maintains, right, the bug list, who has some oversight and control of your bug tracking process. So typically, you'll see your software testers as a key part of the software release in terms of, okay, what are the bugs in your software that customers need to be aware of? So a couple of things that's very important about this standard that causes confusion sometimes. So we kind of talk a little bit here, what are all the things that this standard is not? So this standard is not telling you how to do your development. It will tell you, for example, you have to have a requirements document with certain type of information, that you have to have a verification plan, etc. But it's not telling you how to do your unit tests, how to do your system software tests. It's not telling you what software lifecycle you have to follow. It's not telling you you have to create your plans all first and your requirements all first and do all of your unit testing first and then do all of your system testing. So it does not dictate that it's a waterfall process. It also does not specify documents. It specifies things that have to be created in terms of design, architecture, but it does not specify there needs to be a physical document called architecture. So a lot of times it helps to have those physical documents, but the process is really looking at those activities and tasks that you have to do and not necessarily saying you have to have a document that says A, B, or C. So it leaves a lot up to the company to look at the standard and then say, okay, this is the process. This is how we're going to comply with the standard. This is the templates we're going to follow. And this is how it's going to comply with that standard. So while we're on the topic of risk, so the 62304 standard, we just talked about those 3 safety risks. The FDA itself, within its guidances, also has this categorization of risk. And there they call it level of concern. But they're also looking at it in terms of the severity of injury of that device to the patient or operator. But it's not always because the device fails in some way or there's a defect that leads to a failure in the device. It can be just by how the software is being used. And that's the aspect of validation, is sometimes the customer will use the software differently than maybe we intended or we expected. And just by their use of it normally, but maybe in a different fashion where they're interpreting data wrong, they're entering data wrong, so they themselves may be making a mistake, and through that use error, it can actually lead to harm. So the FDA in its guidance has this risk-based approach, and they call it here the level of concern. So the FDA's level of concern really drives how much documentation you provide. So FDA uses this to look at, okay, how much documentation you need to provide based on that level of concern. And this does get into software testing directly, because part of that extent of documentation is how much unit testing, how much non-functional testing, maybe how much reliability testing, how much system testing coverage around different features, how much testing you have around things you identified as relating to risk. So a lot of this documentation does end up being test documentation. So that classification that FDA has as level of concern is not related to the 62304 classification. So those are 2 different things. And to make it even more confusing sometimes, you have now a device classification. So different devices falls within different classes, 1, 2, or 3. All of these classes really are risk-based, and it's looking from at the lowest level, something that can cause no injury, to the highest level, something that can cause serious injury or death. So while all of these classifications are different, they are risk-focused that drive based on that safety impact, that risk impact, how much you do, and how much you do frequently gets to the software testing level. So if you look at, okay, what does this mean when we look at this FDA's level of concern? So one of the things that's always there is this aspect of traceability. So no matter how much we have in terms of requirements or inputs, we need traceability. Okay, what are the risks? What are the risk controls? What are requirements? What are our testing? And having traceability between all of those aspects. If you look at that middle row, this is the biggest one for software testers. When our level of concern is minor, our testing itself, even at the software system level, becomes simple. It's much higher level functional tests. There's less objective evidence we need, so our expected results are less prescriptive, and our reporting is simpler. Most of medical device software that you'll see lives in that middle box, that moderate level of concern, where we have formal system level, what's called protocols, commonly they're referred to as procedures. Some industry call these plans, but here we're talking about procedures. These are all our test cases grouped together by features. This is where our test steps, expected results live. So that's what's called a protocol here. And in your plans, you're talking about what are you going to do around unit integration testing, how much you do, but you have more freedom what you do at the unit and integration level. And frequently you'll see your integration and system level get combined into one level of testing at that moderate level of concern. Once you get to that major level, things become more prescriptive. It's integration testing gets more formalized with its own protocols. Unit testing gets more formalized with its own protocols. There's much more detail that you have to go into your planning activity. So the rigor and the amount of testing at the different levels of testing increases at that major level of concern. Bug tracking, how you do your bug tracking also changes. So one of the requirements is once you have that moderate or major level of concern, you're required to have this very formal bug tracking process where you look at each bug at the impact on the safety and effectiveness of each bug. So it's not just, okay, here I have a defect and I'm going to defer it. You have to look at how does that software defect impact the safety of the software? How does it impact the effectiveness of the software? And you have this third aspect, does it impede the workflow? If a doctor needs to use a software to accomplish a certain task within 2 minutes, does the bug make that take 5 minutes or 10 minutes? So if you're impacting the workflow that the doctor has to use the software, that also is something that's important to consider in the bugs. So these defects, the first bullet we just talked about, these defects that you have in the software have to go through this assessment. So once you're in the medical device world, once you start finding these defects and verification, there is this overhead that the team has to assess, or individuals within a team have to assess the defects with the impact on the severity. But the second piece that the regulations want you to look at is, wait a second, we're finding all these defects in, let's say, in this one feature. Is there something going on in our development process that it's leading us to have all of this? Our requirements not complete? Did we miss some requirements? Did we miss defining the input for these requirements? Or let's say we're finding defects, a lot of defects in an area in beta testing. Hey, why are we finding these type of defects in beta testing? Should we have found these defects at the SQA level? Are we missing something in our test coverage at the SQA level? So part of the expectation from the FDA regulations is you're actually looking at your defect database and you're trying to understand how you can improve things to either catch the defects earlier or prevent the defects from happening. So this kind of treating your defects as symptoms of, okay, there's something to be improved in the development process, something to be improved in the quality system is asked for within the FDA guidances. So let's jump to this topic of cybersecurity. This has been what I call a growing topic in the medical device space over the last 5 years, and it has really accelerated in the last few years. For the longest while, there were only a few of these FDA guidances or regulations around cybersecurity. In the last 2 to 3 years, it has more than quadrupled in terms of the guidances that's out there, both in the US and in Europe, as something called the medical device regulation. So there's even greater emphasis today on this aspect of cybersecurity. And of course, if we're talking about cybersecurity, we're talking about software. And we're talking about software, that means testing for cybersecurity, using tools to assess cybersecurity vulnerabilities. And it's an area where, as part of a tester's test plans, you do have to focus a lot of effort. And because typically you do not have clear functional requirements around cybersecurity, from a testing perspective, you're looking at it now from a non-functional aspect of how do you test cybersecurity within your software. The last item we'll focus on, which is called post-market surveillance. So one of the regulations that's out there is called post-market surveillance, which means after your software is done, after you ship your software to your customer, you have to be at least annually, and that's the current regulation within the EU, within the MDR, at least annually or biannually. Most companies are doing it annually or more frequently now. You have to proactively look at what security vulnerabilities are out there in the field, not just your software, but competitor software, similar software, and there are cybersecurity databases out there that you can subscribe to perform those searches. But it's expected both the software development team and the software testers are part of that software development team to be assessing security vulnerabilities and both be updating the software and testing the software to show that the software is not vulnerable to whatever is the latest malware, virus, or attacks that's out there on the field. So the FDA themselves call out a few areas that they talk about, which is the software being able to limit access, the software being able to trust the content it's using. So if for example, I'm doing a machine learning app that's taking data from a different source, you may be able to trust that content before your algorithm utilizes it. The second aspect that's tied to software testing is the detection, response, and recovery. That your software needs to have these features, and it can be login features or the features that it knows when there is security compromises and there's an ability of the software to recover when it gets attacked. Software testers today will start getting occupied most of the time in this aspect of post-market surveillance or post-market management. Because whether you're running a cloud app, whether you're running software that's on a device, software that's on a mobile platform, or software that's on a desktop, all of these type of medical device software, there are vulnerabilities that occur all the time. So because there are vulnerabilities, there are patches from vendors, whether it's the OS or some off-the-shelf tool. So software testers is frequently occupied with testing these updates to make sure not only are the updates effective, but the software itself doesn't get broken by applying a cybersecurity patch. So this then drives the need for software testing to have a good regression suite, a good automated suite handy. So when it comes time to roll out these patches, software testing does not get too distracted from their main primary project and can have a nice suite of regression testing to confirm the security patches have not broken something in the software. So let's spend just a couple of minutes talking about what's coming next. Because the world of the software testing is changing a lot, and it's changing a lot because of this bucket of things called digital health. And it's changing not only in the aspect of the software applications under this bucket, but it's changing because the regulations are changing also. So digital health covers a lot of things. It's way more than even the bullets here I identified. But there's this aspect of software as a medical device. There is no hardware. There is no instrument that a software runs on. So software as a medical device, that's the blossoming field. This is where you see AI, where you see a lot of diagnostics, a lot of machine learning. This is that area of software as a medical device. So the FDA is creating new regulations in this space. And there's regulations around mobile health and mobile medical apps. And We'll talk a little bit around kind of the Apple Watch in a second, but that's one area where Apple Watch and its medical device was released kind of under that mobile medical apps. So this whole area of digital health, it's driving its own set of guidances and regulations. If you're kind of out here in the Silicon Valley area, you're in the Boston area in the Northeast, you'll see this topic of software as a medical device becoming the next thing. And within this next thing, the FDA recognizes that its existing regulations are not sufficient. So it's creating new guidances around how this is going to work from not only software development, but a software testing perspective. From the software testing perspective, what's really driving is this idea of that post-market monitoring. So it's asking, even from a testing perspective, once your software launches, you're actively being informed how are your customers using the software? What are the bugs, issues they're running into? And in almost this real-time manner, you're updating your own test cases and your test plans, and you're building out your suite and running that software. So a lot of your testing is after the software is launched, and it's based on the real-world use of the testing. So I did want to talk about kind of the big thing on digital health that made big news over the last month, which is the Apple Watch. So some of you, if you looked either at the announcements or the keynote, would have noticed that Apple has received FDA clearance for the ECG app, and they have multiple clearances going on. So that ECG app is a medical device. It's a Class 2 medical device. They took it through a de novo process, and they got approval under a medical mobile app categorization. But how they got approval, it's using some of the guidances the FDA is looking at piloting and implementing in the future, which is this idea, that bolded phrase at the bottom called good enough data, which is that aspect of how much is good enough to prove, and this is from a testing perspective, right? The good enough data is your test data. What's the good enough data to show that the device is safe and effective to make decisions? So how this was tested was very different than other medical devices. A lot of it was tested on a lot of healthy people. The watch, they ran clinical studies for the last probably a year or so. They collected a lot of data from healthy individuals using the watch who subscribed to kind of the app on the watch, collected that data, and it was testing based on that data, both clinical testing, the algorithm testing, and the software testing. So they collected a lot of that data from that testing perspective, and that was the basis of the submission. But the other interesting aspect of this digital health is the device, right? The medical device, which is this is going to be because the app is on there. It's not a device in a doctor's office. It's not a device in a hospital. It's the device is on you. It's your purchase device that's on you running this medical device software that's collecting the data. And when there's an issue, it notifies you, go see a doctor, or an option that they'll have, it will send the data to the doctor. And within devices like Apple Watch, while it may start off with ECG, if you look at a roadmap, it'll have everything from glucose meters, pulse oximetry, respiration rate, and a whole set of physiological parameters. So this area of digital health becomes the focus, and it changes software testing because software testing will then get realigned with this digital health paradigm. So last summary slide. So what does this all mean from a software tester perspective. What this means are the evidence, the documentation, that it's not only the work we do as software testing, it's the documented, approved, reviewed artifacts we would normally create in a software testing project. Now it has to be put in that form that lives within Design History File. It's the type of testing we do, which is now that risk testing, where we're looking at the risk items work. We're not just testing the software functionality, we're testing that the risk control measures we put into the software work and prevent harm. It's all the different levels of testing and choosing the levels of testing based on all the different risk classifications that we have. So that's at the end. We are ready, I think, Dave, to take questions from anyone.
We are. So if you have any questions, go ahead and type them into your control panel with the GoToWebinar system. We did have a couple that came in early, so I'll at least start on these. The first question is, how does the foundation level certification that you achieved via ISTQB and ASTQB, how does that apply to software testing in the medical devices?
Excellent question. So one of the things we had covered for the level of concern earlier on is unit integration, unit testing, integration testing, the software system testing, validation testing, and reviews. All of these items are actually covered in the ASTQB foundation level. And one of the nice things on the new 2018 syllabus is the new 2018 ASTQB syllabus puts a bigger emphasis on this topic of static testing. This static testing is the same as what the FDA and the regulations call reviews. A big aspect that these regulations recognize is the earlier you can catch defects in your code, your requirements, the better quality the product you will have. So all of those aspects map exactly to topics on this course. So if you have that good basis from foundation, everything from reading these regulations will make sense, right? You know what unit testing means, you know what design reviews or static testing means, you know what the beta testing, user acceptance testing. So there's a good correlation because they're based on similar standards, right? The foundation syllabus have a big tie into the ISO and IEEE standards for software development. And the FDA guidance and international standards also looked at those regulations. So it's familiar with it. So it's very well connected to each other in terms of the terms utilized.
Okay, great. That's very helpful. So you touched upon this next one a little bit during the presentation, but let's ask it very explicitly. Is software testing in an agile SDLC
yes,
really possible for medical devices?
Yes, so it is possible, and it's always the challenge. A lot of these regulations, you notice they talk about plans, they talk about requirements, they talk about testing, they talk about the things that sometimes make it look like a V model, make it look like it's waterfall, but none of the regulations intend to imply you have to meet a waterfall process. But because they're written like a waterfall process, it becomes a struggle sometimes to set up your project to be agile, but none of them prevent agile. And the very nice thing, there's actually some guidances from the Association of Medical Device Manufacturers. It's called TIR 45, but there's some guidances that's out there now recognized by the FDA that give people guidance for how do you implement agile within your software processes. So it's definitely possible, but it takes work within the team with your quality folks and regulatory folks to make sure everyone is on the same page as to what agile means.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's great information. So we're getting close to the end here, so I'm just going to go ahead and probably take one more at this point. But if anyone has questions, so you see on the last slide here, that you can get a hold of Niranjan if you have a follow-up question. So you see his email address and his other contact information. So make sure you copy that down. But here's the big question, I guess. So if someone's interested in medical device software testing, the big question is where do you even start? And I say that kind of with that emphasis because as you covered this material in the presentation, incredibly, great information, but I think it's a little bit overwhelming, and I think it's, it's going to be a little difficult. It's hard for people to even come up with maybe questions about it at this point. So, what's the first step? What should they do if they're really interested in it?
So the first step really is not to be afraid of it. We talk about this whole field being focused on patient safety, right? Harm, and all of the bad things that the software could do based on the type of device. But if you look at the process, if you have good software fundamentals, right? In terms of, and that's why I love kind of the ISTQB syllabus at the different levels. If you have good software testing fundamentals, you can bring those skills to any field. When you go in as a software tester, you do not need to create this risk process for identifying harm. You're going to be part of the team that's going to work on identifying the risk control measures. Really, your role as a tester at the beginning is to just understand that there's this real thing called product risk, and it is actually covered in the CTFL course. There's this real thing called product risk that it's a focus for us, which means when we're testing those aspects, go look at that as a test basis. So your test basis is not just your software requirements document or user story. One of your test bases is now this risk document that the team created. So just to know that you as a tester are part of this risk process, but you're still bringing your good fundamental software testing expertise to the medical device world. So really that's what I caution people. You'll see a lot of acronyms, right? You'll see ISO this, IEC this, FDA that. Don't worry too much about it. You can read about it, but all of these regulations are based on recognized industry standards, and it's just based on what's good software development and testing practices in general.
No, that's great advice, and I think I appreciate the whole bigger picture perspective here that maybe puts some people at ease. And it's a fascinating topic. It's a fascinating area. So again, I want to really thank you for taking time to speak with us today. You did a great job, and anyone who has colleagues who need to hear this information or would like to hear this information, we will go ahead and post a recording onto the ASTQB website in the next few days. And I'd invite you to visit the ASTQB website as you consider what are your next steps with your software testing skill set or your software testing career by checking out that software testing skills and career roadmap on the site. And like I said, feel free to reach out to any of our speakers and from any of the webinars when you listen to them. And there's a number of resources that are available as well. We'll also see if the PowerPoint's available, and if we don't have that posted on the ASTQB website, feel free to contact Niranjan directly via the email address on the screen there. So again, thank you, Niranjan, for all of your help today. This is a great presentation, and we look forward to having you speak with us again.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Have a good day, everyone.